So for those of you that I have not met, my name is Laurie McGrath, and I'm currently serving as Chief Marketing Officer for a company called Intelare. And part of the reason why I'm here introducing both Laurence and Richard is I really am a living testament to what they'll be talking about tonight. When I was driving over here, I was thinking to myself, a year ago, if you would have told me that we would have a room full of people talking about archetypes in relation to organizational alignment and corporate environment, I would not have believed you. But I can't be more thrilled. This has been a vision of mine for quite some time. I think if you look back on my resume, you will see that I am pure blood corporate from college graduation, and I always gravitated toward industries that really didn't lend themselves to a great deal of heart and soul, things like supply chain and procurement and cloud, and now I find myself in healthcare supply chain. Why my story is a little bit unique is that at the moment that I graduated college and started my career, I also that summer went to a lecture on Carl Jung, and I learned about archetypes for the first time. And I was absolutely transformed from that moment. I didn't know a lot about it, but I just knew there was something about it that I really wanted to learn more. And I did. I had really two parallel lives. I had a corporate life that was very private and professional. And then I had a private life where every time I had a free weekend, I would run off to some Jungian retreat or a workshop. I belonged to every Jung society in Minneapolis and St. Louis and Chicago. Like, I just could not get enough of it. And I was convinced that in order for me to really live as close as I needed to live to what my calling was, that I had to get out of corporate America, and I had to just take all of my time and just embed myself into archetypes because they were so beneficial for me in my life. And what I didn't realize, and I was completely unaware, I actually started a doctorate program in depth psychology with a Jungian foundation, and my vision, because I always have like a personal vision, was that I would have a little office somewhere around here, and I would do personal therapy all around depth psychology, and I would help people with archetypes learn how to live their life better and relate to people and really teach them this language that I found so transformational. And here I am today, and I'm still in corporate America, and I haven't finished my degree, and I couldn't be more satisfied because I realized that all along I was integrating both worlds without even being aware of it. That the success that I have had in the industries in the corporate world, I can attribute a great deal to archetypes. And the world of Jung is vast and deep, and it can be really convoluted and mythical, and it's easy just to shut a book and say that guy was on something. But I think even if you take a piece of it and you use it as a language that helps you learn how to navigate life better, it helps me not only in my personal life, but what I found is it really helped me in the corporate life. It helped me deal with investors. It helped me deal with my team. There would be times that I'm like, I have to go into warrior mode right now, and I need to be the transformer. And it's like you have this language that you can easily navigate through in order to have better success. So I would just say to you tonight, for those of you that this is a new subject, just be open, even if you just take one thing away and it causes you to want to read a little bit more about it. For me, I felt like it really surpassed other leadership language around, stabilizer and controller, and not, I think there's I think there's room for everything, but this is a little bit deeper, in my opinion, and I could not be more thrilled to be here, and I am honored to have been able to spend the day with Richard and with Laurence in this fantastic workshop where the caliber of people that were there, that flew all the way from Alaska to take part in this and to really understand how to use archetypes the best way you can in order to make your life better. And I would just end on the fact that the thing that I really underestimated was whether you're in corporate America or sitting at a dinner party talking to someone, that we're all human, and there's a basic need in all of us, no matter if you're a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company or you whatever you choose to do, that we all want have a desire to want to be the best person we can and to have deep connections and to establish those and to really affect change in the best possible way. So it is so lovely to see all of your faces. I can't tell you how special this night is to me, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Laurence and to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. So a big thank you to Laurie for helping bring this salon to you guys. I just wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about Be Human Project. Our mission is to embolden leaders to experiment with making their businesses and organizations more human. And we like that language because it's pithy and seems like it could fit on a bumper sticker, or almost, and long bumper sticker. But it's not just a platitude. There's some rigor behind what we mean when we say make business more human. And I want to just talk for just a moment about one particular aspect of that, and that is that we have this sort of strong belief that the tools that we use should not force us to conform to them, that we should not be made to conform to our tools, right? That when we use, we see this in common ways more and more, like with your mobile devices, with computer interfaces that you use, and sort of deeper understanding of the necessity for designing the experience and understanding that there is a person having that experience, that people, users are people, they have experiences. And that it's not just about the elegance of some tool or how it's put together, but it's ultimately about how the person will use it, how they will interact with it. Well, we believe that's also true about organization, about the way that we manage people, the way that we work together. And so what we say is that we believe we shouldn't be made to conform to our tools. Our tools should be made to conform to us. And so one way in which we try to address that need is to talk about how human beings naturally act, what really composes us. Why do we act the way that we do? Why do we think the way that we do? Why do we have those feelings that we have in the moments that we have them that are not necessarily always something that we're so pleased to have had happen, right? We have responses to stimulus in our environments that we sometimes feel is out of our control. And if we're going to design systems and organizations that are more human, we have to really have a deeper understanding of what it really means to be human. And so for that reason, I am extraordinarily grateful that Richard and Laurence are here with us this evening, because they know a great deal about the subject and spend a lot of time thinking about how to help people who are in leadership positions to understand themselves better and understand the world that they navigate. There's also just a bit of very profound synchronicity in all of this as well. I met Laurie and Laurence within a couple of months of one another, both of whom were interested very deeply in the same issues and wanting to bring them more deeply into business. And it just couldn't have been more curious and interesting and amazing that should happen. And then that Laurence should say that Richard was going to be here in St. Louis, and I said, well, we gotta have a salon. So we're lucky to have them, and I appreciate everybody coming tonight. And so I won't continue to bore you with this. We'll let you get to the good stuff. So here's Richard Olivier and Laurence Hillman.
Give us the 10-minute warning. I'll start with a poem. It's called The Contract, a word from the lead. And in the end, we follow them. And in the end, we follow them. Not because we are paid, not because we might see some advantage, not because of the things they have accomplished, not even because of the dreams they dream, but simply because of who they are. The man, the woman, the leader, the boss, standing up there when the wave hits the rock, passing out faith and confidence like life jackets, knowing the currents, holding the doubts, imagining the delights and terrors of every landfall. Captain, pirate, and parent by turns, the bearer of our countless hopes and expectations. We give them our trust. We give them our effort. What we ask in return is that they stay true. We give them our trust. We give them our effort. What we ask in return is that they stay true. And we could ask, stay true to what? To themselves, to the mission of the project, to a bigger enterprise that is being served by the project, perhaps all of the above. But this piece requires self-knowledge to be a leader who can hold all of those. And one of the things that I believe very passionately is that more self-aware human beings make better leaders. So I come from the world of theatre. I was a theatre director for 15 years. My parents are both actors, very steeped in theatrical tradition. And I got to the point where I felt like I needed to do something different than the field I'd been marinated in since I was a young child in theatre. And what I was really interested in was applying the lessons of performance from the theatre into the field of leadership and professional development. What makes a high-performing team? That was my job in the theatre. You'd inherit a bunch of actors, you had 6 weeks, you had a story, and you had to create a peak-performing team in that time. Didn't always work. But when it did, when the magic happened, when the souffle rose, when the story sung, when it got in front of an audience, so those were special times. And there were certain things that were happening in those times. And one of them was that everyone collectively believed in the story that we were telling. So what was it that we were trying to put across to the audience, customers, clients, however we want to think of them? We all believed in the same story. And the second was that we were all willing to take risks and develop ourselves in pursuit of telling that story that we were aligned behind. So none of us was stuck in a rut saying, well, this is how I always do it, go bug someone else if you want something different, which I did get from a few actors over the years, to be fair. Some actors are just very happy doing their thing, and that's fine, but I didn't want to work with them. And so I took a leap of faith in 1998, 99. I've been working at the Globe Theatre. We'd had an amazing energy around opening a new building, bringing a 400-year-old building back to life. And as part of that work, we started experimenting with some of these ideas of using stories, archetypes, poetry in leadership. And for whatever reasons, we called a little zeitgeist at the time. What was then being called arts-based training was beginning to take off. I have a friend who wrote this, a poet. There are poets in business. There are sculptors. There are graphic designers. There are people teaching teams how to sing. And we came in with this theatre piece around peak performance. And the piece that felt like the kind of really fundamental piece of the jigsaw was when I also learned how to bring the archetypes in. If you think of any great film that you know, or your favorite play or story, there are archetypal characters in that story. It might be the hero and the villain, or the lover and the comic. There will be characters that we recognize, that every culture will recognize, and no matter what part of the world they come from. These archetypal characters last through time. And there are certain ways, and Laurence is an expert in one of those ways, over thousands of years, that human beings have made sense of these archetypal characters and have formulated them and associated various habits, behaviors, costumes, if you like, manners, styles with them. So we can think of the archetypes as situational leadership, that I know how to change how I show up in order to meet the situation at hand. We can think of it as leadership styles, being able to develop greater adaptability. Or we can think of it as characters, and being able to kind of, change the costume and show up as a different character when our people need to see something different from ourselves. So if that gives you just as a kind of overview, as a little opening piece of why the arts, why story, and why archetypes. And I will hand over to Laurence to tell us a little more about why these archetypes.
Okay.
And Jekyll, yeah.
Thanks. So, 40 years ago this year, when I was 16, my mother was very interested in astrology. We had a family friend who was an astrologer. My mother had always been intrigued by that, and she said, she saw I was bored in school. She said, "Why don't you go study astrology with him?" I was 16, I'm like, whatever. So I got on my moped and I drove down. I was living in Switzerland at the time. My father was studying and actually became director of studies at the Jung Institute. So my connection to Jung is very personal. And so I'm sitting in front of this family friend, teacher, and he starts to talk, and 5 minutes into my first lesson, I said, "This is what I'm going to do all my life." It was absolutely crystal clear. I was 16. And never looked back, and it is what I've been doing for 16 years in lots of different ways. And I have to tell you that standing here in front of you in a business setting talking about astrology is a rather interesting experience, especially perhaps in St. Louis. We're not in California or Portland. So it is really a tool. It is simply a tool, and I've used it. I've worked with people all over the world. I talk to people literally in every continent and literally in 20, 30 countries. And so I help people. I give people insights, ideas into their personal archetypal story, which can be seen as a reflection of the planets. That's a whole other question, why and if and how does astrology work. That's really not what we're doing today. But if you would just indulge me and say that the reason we have picked these 10 archetypes that are on your lists is because those are the ones we've been working with now for about 20 years together. They're extremely effective, and those of you who've had the experience of working with us in the corporate setting with these see how effective and powerful they really can be. And so we could call them different things. We're giving them names that are more corporately acceptable, but we're also putting in the names of the planets that stand behind them, just to show you that there is an ancient connection here that we are using. It's not important. We're not doing astrology. We're talking about archetypes. But the place I come from, the language that I've been deeply invested in for the last 40 years is that one. It's simply a way of looking at the world in an archetypal way. So the particular kind of astrology is called archetypal astrology, which sees the planets as representations of archetypes. And that is where we're coming from. So archetypes, Richard's already given it to you, but they're patterns, they're universal experiences. It's one way that brings us together. In other words, I can recognize the trickster or the jester or the king in any culture, and if I do, there's less separation. I immediately have a language that I understand. If I know my own trickster, I can relate as my trickster to that trickster. It's a way of understanding and knowing myself deeper. Know thyself is really what we're about, because we think, as Richard said, that makes for better leaders, better leadership, and then better companies. So that's really what I have to say about as an introduction.
Thank you. So we would love to give you a little chance now to self-diagnose. Okay? Particularly if you're with someone who knows you well, this is, and feel free to engage with a complete stranger if the person sitting next to you knows you too well. Okay? But what we would like you to do is spend about 5 or 6 minutes just looking through the first sheet that has the word keywords, archetypes at work, is the place to focus, and to see if you can, you've got 2 pages with the colors and the archetypes on. This one, can everyone find the one that says keywords? Yeah? To look through it and to really get a sense of which one feels most like me on a good day. The good day is important for reasons we'll get to later. Which one feels, and there may be 2 or 3 that are really close, and then you can maybe just share with the person sitting next to you when you've had a chance to look through, what do I feel might be the 1 to 3 archetypes that I feel most happy with, comfortable with, in tune with in my working life.
Right, just to be clear, it's not the page that says offerings or culture at the top. It's the one that says keywords. It wasn't your first page. It's in the packet. It starts with keywords at the top. Keywords, archetypes at work. That's the page you're working with.
Okay, so off you go, read and then chat, and we'll come back and see where you are.
Do we have the offerings sheet here too?
No.
Do we need it?
Oh, I think they all handed out. You can ask Haley. Okay.
Excuse me. What's that? I'd cut it. I'd stop. You want more? We have limited time. I would stop. It's been 4 minutes.
We said 6. It's been 4? Yeah, we said 6. Okay, so if you can hold these, I need to get to the poems. Okay, folks, so if you can settle down. So we will give you more time to work with this. Can we just have a quick show of hands? How many people think they spotted at least one of the archetypes that would be a favorite or close favorite? Great.
I'm sorry, I was talking. What did you say?
If you spotted an archetype that would be a favorite. Fantastic. Right, okay, so here is part of what we would call our sort of beliefs around it. We all have favorite archetypes. There may be times in our life when we change and some other energy comes into our life, and our archetypal makeup, we call it the archetypal patterning, changes naturally. There will be other times when the world changes. When what we are meeting out there suddenly shifts perspective. And that may be a time when we need to shape up, when we need to review or even renew our archetypal pattern to fit the external situation. Okay? So I had an example in Europe. One of my big clients is Daimler Corporation, Mercedes-Benz, Fuso Trucks, Mitsubishi, Smart, et cetera, Freightliner. And their top 100 went to Silicon Valley 3 years ago and had their minds blown away. In a single week, they realized overnight that their competitors were no longer BMW and Audi, it was Google and Apple. Now, they had a very traditional German engineering, patriarchal, sovereign, strategist, warrior culture. You've worked for them? Which had made them a top-selling, top 10 recognizable brand in the world for nearly 100 years. But right now, everything that made them fit for purpose back then was about to seriously get in their way. That if they didn't come up with a new way of thinking about their business, and therefore a new way of thinking about their leadership capacities that would be required to drive that business into a successful future, they were likely to be creatively disrupted, at least out of the top 10 and possibly out of history. And they got it, and they saw it. And me and colleagues and lots of other people, including wonderful consultant called Otto Scharmer, works at MIT, have been working with their leadership culture to see what is the new pattern that needs to come in. Okay? So sometimes we evolve, we naturally get a new capacity. Sometimes the world shifts and we need to catch up. Now the other premise of our work is that if you are being taken too much out of the zone that gives you meaning, you won't enjoy it. That actually the archetypes are a way of checking if you are living your working life on purpose, if there is purpose and meaning in it. A wonderful American writer called Studs Terkel, who died a few years ago, he's 90, wrote a book called Working. He interviewed 10,000 people across the States, and he basically summed up his findings in the preface. Work is about a search for daily meaning as well as daily bread, for recognition as well as cash, for astonishment rather than boredom. In short, for a sort of life rather than a Monday to Friday sort of dying. And the things that make your working experience a sort of life rather than a Monday to Friday sort of dying are deeply connected to your archetypal patterns. The things that get you up in the morning to show up to work with a smile on your face are yours. And they may be very different than the person sitting next to you. But in organizational life and in teams, we can, of course, connect and build collegiality and alignment across all the archetypes. On one level, we could argue that all the archetypes will serve a business, but you will have some that are consciously activated, that are leading the way, and you will have some that are less consciously activated, that could be a latent potential. And often what we find if we go in and work with teams and organizations, it is the ones that are less activated where the biggest learning is. And what can happen is that your favorite archetypes, we can overplay them. Have you ever seen an actor who is always cast in the same role? And you get to the fifth film and there's a little bit of you going, boring, I know what's going to happen, I know he's going to go like that, and this, and whatever. It loses interest if there's no repertoire development. And performances get stale. And we've experienced many leadership cultures that go through this exact same thing. They overplay their favorite characters, and over time it gets a bit stale. So the next little piece, do you want to chip in before we go into the shadow piece a little bit?
Yeah, I wanted to address this issue of all the archetypes. From my perspective, all the archetypes are always present everywhere. It's just they're more or less conscious. And so, just like anything else, if we're not aware of the ones that we are not embodying or don't want to have or don't want to see, those are the ones that bite us in the rear end the most. And then people come and they express them in their worst possible ways. And then the question is, how are other ways to express them? The other thing is, because they're archetypes and because they're universal, there's as many ways to express any of these archetypes as there are people in the world. There is no one way. There's no rules. You have a few key words. You could extend that to the extent of the English language. There's no limit, and even beyond that, because there are other languages. So it's a rich universal language that is also extremely personal because of how you are expressing that archetype.
Great. So what we're going to do, the next little exercise we're going to invite you to participate in, is to identify the most inspired working experience in your life to date. Okay? Just track back. Yes, you have had one, sir. I know you have. We want you to find a time when you felt absolutely on song. In sports, they call this in the zone. In psychology, they call it flow state. In theatre, we call it peak performance. It all basically means the same thing. A time when you were doing something that absolutely gave you meaning, when you couldn't wait to get up in the morning and go in to do this. Okay? Equally important, only slightly more depressing, we are going to ask you all to identify the least inspired time in your working life to date. Okay, so we're really trying to draw a huge gap, but a time when you weren't aligned, when you weren't enjoying, when it was hell to get out of bed, that's like you was pulling teeth to get anything done in your working environment, when for whatever reason it wasn't working for you. Okay, so can everyone identify one of those times? It may not be the biggest and the worst, but it's definitely two times that have a different, very different flavor for you in terms of personal satisfaction and meaning. Yeah? Everyone got one? Okay. So we are going to then invite you, in a moment there's going to be a little bit of creative chaos, because we are going to invite you to move your chairs so that you can more closely face the person you're talking with. It can be the same partner as before or not. So just careful if there are drinks on the floor. But you just don't want to be sitting next to them, even if it's, you're sort of facing at an angle. So if we could rearrange the furniture, and I will come back to you in a moment before you start.
Already started.
Okay, thank you. Very creative and not so chaotic. We must have some business leaders in the room. Okay, if you could listen up. listen up so you know what we're doing. Firstly, you need to choose who is A and who is B. Could everyone choose an A and a B in their pair? Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Next step. Excellent. A's, you are the first listeners. Okay. Now, B's. Okay.
Say that again.
Thank you. So, B is going to listen to 2 stories. A is going to speak 2 stories. You're only going to have 90 seconds per story, so please listen for the bell. Otherwise, we will move to plan B, the whistle. Okay? So, 90 seconds, we want you to tell whichever story you want to start with. Okay? Then we'll stop, we'll give you a few seconds, and you will tell the other story. Okay? Then you will switch, and again I'll tell you the stages, and you will listen, and your partner will tell you both stories. Your job while listening is to watch closely, to notice how is this person showing up when they tell me this story? How do they sound? And what is different about how they show up from story 1 to story 2? Okay, and we're going to catch that out front in 8 or 10 minutes. Okay, so the first, B, you are going to choose which story you want to start with and think about that story. What was happening at that time in your working life? Turn to your partner and tell that story for 90 seconds.
I like the organized chaos. I like the organized chaos. It's Q&A,
Okay, hold. Now, if you're at a cliffhanger, this is a good reason to find your partner for a drink afterwards, okay, to hear the rest of the story. Because right now, we are going to ask you to change what you're thinking about. As the storyteller, we want you to drop story 1 and start imaginatively recalling story 2. This very different time in your working life. What was different? How was it a felt, differentiated experience for you, particularly from the story you were just talking about? What was shaping this very different experience? And for the next 90 seconds, tell that story, and the observer, partner, please notice how your storyteller shows up differently. Okay? You are least inspired. And if you want to take it, when we've finished the story and we've pulled it up, the idea would be to talk a little bit about feeling aligned with your purpose and how the archetypes might feed into that. So you can wing it. I mean, I can do it, but if you've got some way of getting into it that feels good, let me know.
I have a story. That person isn't here.
It would be more like input, but if you've got a good example, that could work as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to swap roles now. So the first observer, just remember what you've noticed that was different. Now you are the storyteller, and the person who was telling the stories is now going to be your listener and observer. So our new storytellers, please just decide which story you want to start with and bring a couple of memories or a picture of what was going on at that time in your working life that might have, that reminds you of this time. Find a place to start just to shift your thinking and then tell that story for the next 90 seconds.
Could we maybe keep our voices down? It's very hard to hear.
If we can, for some in the middle are surrounded by joyous voices, so if we can, keep it down a little bit. Thank you. Okay. Or not.
These are all leaders. They're used to big outside voice.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If we can, story one. Okay. And the observers, just notice how your storyteller showed up in story one, and you're going to really clock as many differences as you can in story two. Storytellers, please now change your attention from story one to story two. What would be a picture, a memory? What did it feel like to work in this very different working situation than that you've just been talking about? Bring it to mind, get a picture or a sense of it, and turn back to your partner for the next 90 seconds. So I'm going to give them 5 minutes for feedback to each other.
That much?
4. I need to pee.
Give it to them. Well, give the directions first. I don't know that my voice is loud enough. remember where the restroom is? Turn this off when you pee. Just, I don't know, ask. 8 more minutes, you can hold it. Oh no, it's 28, 38.
My friend, a consultant from Atlanta, says, don't make him go to Plan C, okay? All right, guys, thank you. Now, you've got 4 minutes to feedback. Now, here's the thing. Do not feedback about the content, feedback about the behavior. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you notice? If this was an actor on stage and you were their reflector, their feedback, their coach, how did they show up differently between story 1 and story 2? Okay, and we want to try and get some real key differences. And then when you've all had a chance to talk, we're going to catch a few of the most obvious ones up here, just to take it to the next step. 4 minutes, off you go.
Even in your great story, you sort of had a sly smile, like, that's cool, but you're not a personal person anyway. So what's the point? You're very sort of understated. Your bad story, I think it was more like, I'm not surprised this happened. And, you know, this is so typical. And you were sort of like saying, you were more disgusted, I think, even with, you're more disgusted with the concept of this happened versus the thing that really happened. So it's like you said, can you believe this is still happening right now? Richard lives in London, but Laurence we didn't know what they were going to do. So this is different from other songs. I don't know Jason. So Jordan, the guy from Dave, and we just started talking to him. They had some kind of technical challenge, and then we're going to do it. So they've given us an opportunity to kind of do like a mini game with the blog and kind of try it out. So they're not 8 blind, but they're kind of blind. We have blind. And I love their brand. I mean, they really do. So it's, you know, it's kind of like you guys, like what you want your as clients who share the values
get a few people to shout, and we'll just catch. I'll catch the positive, you catch the negative.
Yeah, but we'll just a few, just a couple.
Okay. Thank you very much. Full time. Okay. Now, what we would like, if you would like to gently and subtly realign your chairs so you're more facing front, without knocking wine or landing on people's toes, preferably. Okay. And what we would like is to invite a few people to call out the biggest difference that you noticed in the person you were observing. It can be a pair of words or a pair of phrases, and Laurence and me are going to catch them and just build up a couple of different pictures.
Pride versus sadness.
Pride and sadness.
Emotional versus accomplishment. Emotional versus
What kind of emotion?
sadness.
So, okay, so sadness again, and accomplishment here. Okay. What about things that you saw? Because these are slightly interpretive things. What did you see?
Well, two points. One, we're talking about the negative. In both cases, reverted back to childhood.
Okay.
Not about professional, but childhood.
Okay.
And then on the positive, rather serene and kind of the eyes going back and kind of satisfied.
Great.
Versus shoulders forward.
Shoulders forward.
Very
Shoulders forward.
on the offense.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Least inspired, there was a lot less eye contact.
Yes, I was going to say.
Less eye contact, more eye contact. Great. Great. Yes, sir.
Guarded. I wasn't on both positive and negative.
Okay. So what was the biggest difference that you saw or heard?
Very little difference.
Okay. But could you define it?
No.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Guarded.
Guarded. Okay.
Let me get I found even keel in strength.
Even
sorry.
keel.
I found even keel in strength
in this one. Oh,
with him.
okay.
With my partner. Yeah.
But the biggest difference between story 1 and story 2?
Not just the story. The downer was that he was going to move on and take care of it. So even keel and strength, and I think.
Okay.
So
okay.
there really wasn't
so
a whole lot of.
just for this purpose, we're looking for differences.
Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Her whole body color, like the cold glow of her face, went from kind of just drab to alive.
Alive and drab. Thank you. Where's that? Yes. Yes, sir.
So least inspired was nonchalantness, and then the most inspired was intensity.
Intense. Yep.
I had the opposite. I think the least inspired was very, very angry and focused. Least inspired. And then the most inspired was hopeful and
Okay.
not as intense.
Okay. Yeah. No, the intensity can manifest, but there would probably be an intense positive charge for some people, whereas others might have an intense negative charge. Yeah.
He had a change in his eyebrows when he was telling both stories. So least inspired, they were very furrowed the whole time.
Okay.
But most inspired, they were bright.
Great.
wide.
So furrowed brows and bright eyes.
Sure.
Yes. Okay. Great.
For most inspired, the sense of excitement and an increased speed in speech, talking faster.
Okay. Faster. Okay. Simon and faster. So slower over there. Great. One more. We got.
For
Yes.
most inspired, body was just very erect, very upright, and for least inspired, it kind of started bending
Slumped.
over.
Okay. So upright and slumped. Great. Great. Okay, so for the vast majority of people in the room, there was a visible difference, okay? And we'll get to those who didn't get a visible difference at the moment. But if we were to take these, for instance, as two different human beings, Okay? So we have one human being who is full of pride, has bright eyes, accomplished, serene, satisfied, giving positive eye contact, feels alive, has a positive intensity, exudes hope, excitement, who can speak with pace and stands upright. Exhibit number one. Exhibit number two.
Is sad, is slower, has negative childhood experiences manifesting in shoulders forward, less eye contact, drab, nonchalant, angry, furrowed brow, and slumped.
Who would you rather be led by? It probably depends on your pattern, but you know. And of course, for those of you who are leaders in the room, when you show up to work tomorrow, is tomorrow Friday? Yes. When you show up to work tomorrow, who are your people going to rather be led by?
Does it say anything about if they led with a positive story or the negative story?
No, some people like to get the negative out the way first. Some people just like to go with, you know, the positive. So no, not that I'm aware of, but maybe. Yeah. Okay. So what we want to do now is just make a few comments about this and then hand it over for questions. So one of the things that we would say is that it is likely, and you've got the sheet, so we won't do it now, but you can have a look at it later. It is likely that the time you were talking about when you were most inspired, your favorite archetypes were in play. Were being called on, were being utilized, were adding value to your situation. And it is also likely that that was not true over here. Now, there are two different shadows that might be true. It could be that people were overplaying the archetypes so much that you experienced overwhelm, or that people were actually asking you to operate in your less favorite archetypes and you were feeling out of sorts because you were not being called on in terms of what gets you up in the morning with a smile on your face. So if we were then to just put that in a small, simple map, if we were the individual sense of purpose, what gets you out of bed in the morning, the organizational mission and vision, the role that you are playing at work or the project that you are leading at work, what kind of alignment do you feel with that? This is the equivalent of what we call the dark night of the soul. This is probably a bit how it felt over there. You know, I'm not connected, I'm not aligned, I'm not engaged. This is just tough. Then there's the kind of human level, which we hope a lot of our workers get to, where, yeah, some of it, I feel part of me is engaged at work, but there's part of me that isn't. Now, the piece that we call inspired leadership, when these invisible dynamics of leadership are on show, that is what an inspired leader looks like and feels like, where I am the right person in the right place, doing the right thing in the right way. And the ability for us as individuals and for our teams to align our teams to get our people as near as we can matching, you know, what gets them out of bed in the morning with the organizational role that's required of them, you will liberate a huge amount of potential and discretionary effort. Because I could almost guarantee you that in the most inspired story, you were willing to give extra. Even if it didn't get paid, you were giving it because you enjoyed it. And over here, you wanted overtime. Double, triple overtime with knobs on and a large scotch at the end of the day. That's how, yeah? So this alignment, it works personally, it works professionally, and it also works organizationally. Okay, so that's the kind of idea, and we'll ask for some questions in a minute, but how would you like to wrap up from the archetypal perspective?
Well, the issue of alignment on a personal level is what I have been working with people for decades. And there is a way to see that astrologically, but there's also a way that most of us know when we are aligned with these moments that we know we're in the flow, as I usually call it. And it usually is that the archetypes that are most natural to us, and they really are just a part of us and speak through us, are doing something that fits them. And that's what gets us up, that's what moves us, that's what gives us this sense of I'm doing what I came here to do on a much larger scale. And there are always other voices. I'm supposed to do this, I have these responsibilities and so forth. I will end with a quick story. About 25 years ago or so, somebody came to me, middle management guy here in town, and he had a very clear, I was wondering before I saw him if he was an artist. And maybe even a sculptor, because he was very, some things that I saw in the chart. I was just curious. And he comes in and he's wearing a three-piece suit and he's got, tie, and it's got middle management, classic middle management kind of guy. Very nice, very friendly, but very, very depressed. Walks like this, hunched over. And so I said, so he starts to complain. I said, so why are you here? He says, well, I've got my mortgages, and my wife is complaining, and my kids are in college, and I got all this. He just started piling up all the stuff that we all know. We all have these situations. And I sort of stopped him after a while. I said, okay, so let me ask you something. If you didn't have any of that, you didn't have a wife who needed things, you didn't have kids who needed things, you didn't have a job that needed things, if you could do whatever you wanted, what would you do? This middle-level management guy in his late 40s looked down at the floor, burst out crying, and said, I would move to Florence and I would sculpt. And I thought to myself, you know what, he knows, a part of him knows. But there were all these things that got in the way, the whole story and everything else. So then the question is, what do I do with that? That becomes a different question. But my point with the story is that we all know on some deep level what it is that moves us and gets us to that place of alignment, what gets us into these two circles. I'll just end with that it is possible to do. And it's not always as radical as what he might have had to do to get that. There were things we then discussed that helped him, but the point is that we all know somewhere we have that voice.
So, we'd love to hand the floor over to you. Questions, comments? Yeah.
I have a question.
Hold on, real quick, let me get you the microphone.
Oh, okay, thanks. Well, my. Okay, so I'm wondering, do you find that entrepreneurs find themselves within the two circles much easier and much quicker than people that are working, corporate or working somewhere else, compared to if you're an entrepreneurial spirit?
They go in quicker and out quicker. Yeah, it's quick. It's the dynamic in a lot of the entrepreneurs I've worked with. Yeah.
So do you see them having any staying power?
The most difficult bit for most entrepreneurs is when they have to sustain the success based on the idea they had 5 years ago, because a little bit of them, if they're they might be in the dreamer archetype, they will be in the kind of creative thinking mode, will be wanting to keep reinventing the wheel and come up with the next best thing. So stabilizing becomes an issue for them, and that's often when they will pay other people to come in and stabilize for them.
Yeah, two questions. One, the use of astrology, is that more an issue that humans ascribed the archetypes to the planets and to the skies, and that we're using that as kind of a framework? Mm-hmm. I mean, I assume maybe that's what is happening. I don't, that's the question. And the second is, given the kind of the Freudian psychology has hit a wall, as we've seen if you read and what's going on. How would you compare Jungian psychology to Freudian?
Well, that's a long story, but to the first part, yes, that is certainly one way you can see it, is the ascribing, but it's also empirical. So if you watch for thousands of years, you watch correlations between planets, and you see that Mars is really a red planet, you start associating Mars with red anger and hot anger and that kind of a thing, and the warrior, that correlation over thousands of years starts telling a story. Jungian, Freudian, they're very, very different. Jung is really an imaginal psychology. It has to do with a lot of imagination. It has to do with some core terms that we all use. Introvert, extrovert is Jungian. AA is based on Jungian ideas. The Myers-Briggs is based on Jungian ideas. It's very much in our culture in many ways. But it has to do with a sense that it is archetypal. That's Jung's big contribution, is that there are core archetypes that exist within us. But it's really, his psychology is really called analytical psychology or depth psychology. And then archetypal psychology, which also exists, which my father actually is the originator of, also exists, and that is much more specifically seeing the archetypes as the key to understanding human behavior and human beings. But it's really based on it's much more about, so dreams, for instance, matter in different ways to Freud and to Jung, but they both use dreams, whereas behaviorists don't care about dreams. That's just something crazy going on in your brain. So it's a perception of what's important.
questions back here?
Yes. I don't know if the Jungian archetypes have anything to do with, I guess, the generational archetypes. Have you guys heard of, I guess, Neil Strauss and Howe, Howe, authors? They did a study on generational archetypes. Are there any, I don't know, I guess, similarities between the two?
Well, there are generational archetypes in astrology, the slower ones, the three that you can't see with your eyes, which is Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And yes, Pluto is still a planet. So those three give you a sense of what is generational, because they move very slowly, and the whole generation, everybody who went to grade school with you has the same Pluto position as you. So that's a generation thing that expresses itself in you. So you are part of a generation, but there's also a specific way that you express that generational energy in you. So yes, there is, from a Jungian point of view, are they generational? Yeah, Jung does talk about, he does talk about eras in history, and he does talk about a consciousness that arrives at certain levels and so forth. Yes, he does.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no question, I would like Laurence to say something about the shifting archetypal pattern now. That what is it about this age, the 21st century, that is peculiar and specific?
Right. Well, I get a lot of questions about, what the heck's happening. I get that call often. and especially so, there's lots of different ways to look at what's happening. There's lots of different conversations going on in that area. As an astrologer, we talk about the age of Aquarius and what does that really mean. And there's other parts that also belong to it. It's kind of a perfect storm of things that are happening. But I do want to address briefly, since you're giving me the opportunity to speak about the age of Aquarius and what it really means. There are shifting of ages, which has to do with what's called the precession of the equinox. I won't get into it, but we live in approximately 2,000-year periods. So the last 2,000 years, from around the year 0 to around the year 2000, it was what's called the age of Pisces. And now we're moving into the age of Aquarius. When exactly does it begin? As my friend says, when is it dawn? Is it when you see the first rays of the sun, or when the sun is above the horizon? So we're in a period of shifting. That might last 50 years, 100, 200, who knows? But there are clearly things that are going on in this era and in this time that have to do with clear Aquarian symbolism, which has to do with the collective, it has to do with networking, it has to do with a detachment, it has to do with automation, it has to do with AI, it has to do with an abstract sense about things, and is a very, very different model to the ones that we've had. The biggest difference between the Piscean model and the Aquarian model, that shift, is that the Piscean model is, in every way, shape, and form that we know it, is a top-down pyramidical model. So you can start, for instance, you go back a couple hundred years, you have the church. You have one pope at the top, all the way down to the people in the pew. You have one CEO, all the way down to the people on the line making the cars. You have one, let's say, one general, all the way down to the guy in the trenches. This model of top-down is pretty much what we've known. And that's all really that we know. And we really live by that hierarchical model still. The Aquarian model, when I teach this, I say I have a pyramid like this with a sort of a light at the top for that individual, whatever we call it, CEO, God, General, Pope, whatever it is. Even the monotheistic model is one like that. And then the question is, what did you think the next model is? And people tell me circle, they tell me this and that. What I show them as the next picture is an exploded three-dimensional matrix. The movie Matrix has a lot to say about what this new model is about. It is a point-to-point, centerless connections. And one of the things about that is it is very, very powerful because there's no head. There's no center. So you can't, even when you take out Osama bin Laden, there is still a network because there are these individual nodes that you can't destroy a network. You can only take out a leader when it's a top-down model. So the thinking of going into a top-down model approach to something that's a matrix doesn't work. The military is finding that out. A lot of people are finding that out in other ways, even in business. So one of the things is to understand how am I a node? How am I connected to my different points that are in this three-dimensional system? That's one question. And that's a really Aquarian question. And there are other pieces that we want to recognize. For instance, that there is, in each age, there's also the opposite of the sign that is sort of guiding that age, if you want. So we had Pisces. The opposite of Pisces is Virgo, which is rationality, and which is literalism, and which is organization, and these kind of things. So the argument between science and belief, which has been going on for 2,000 years and is still being debated in parts of Kansas, where, you know, do we have that conversation was a key conversation to ask Galileo. You know, these were key conversations for the last 2,000 years. In the new era, and this might be interesting to think about, the conversation is again about a dyad, but the dyad is between Aquarius and Leo is the opposite sign of Aquarius. And Leo is the most negative stuff we've seen about Leo is celebrity worship, is making the Kardashians important, that kind of a thing. It's the idea that somebody who's a celebrity or somebody who is, you know, is famous for the sake of being famous is important. So we have a very negative image right now of sort of the star power versus the group, which is sort of everybody, which is the network sort of model. It's much more complex than that. I'm giving you a simple image. But so one of the questions that I'm asking is, what would a society look like where we take these two opposites, instead of going back into 2,000 years of fighting between the individual and the group, which is also tribalism, and, you know, I need to protect myself because this group is too scary. I don't want to be a world citizen. I want to be, you know, live in this little group. That's a big part of tribalism versus the whole. And so one of the questions is, how do I pull myself into a third? How do I live in a third piece? And I have called that a society of sovereigns. And what I mean with that is that, yes, we do the Leo thing. We all go and find out who we are. We do self-exploration. We do the hero's journey. We go to therapy. We do our ropes courses. We do the stuff that we need to do. I believe in that. That's what I do for a living, is helping people find that. But we don't stay there. We don't then become, you know, sort of, yes, conscious individuals who just think the world is nuts. From there, we step into, imagine a ballroom full of sovereigns. People have done this Leo work. There is no image in any fairy tales that shows up more than one, maybe two kings. And when they are, they're either exchanging kids or they're fighting. So imagine or queens for that matter, kings or queens. It's the sovereign part of us. Imagine a ballroom full of such people. That is my vision of a combined future where people are actually conscious of who they are aware of their inner story, and they're bringing it to a collective in a ballroom kind of setting.
And the network society. Yeah. And you can think about, you know, who's running the show. I mean, those creative disruptors, right? I mean, yes, they've got CEOs and investors, but the Ubers are taking out the Hilton, you know, they're taking out taxis in London. You know, the Airbnb has taken out Hilton and stuff. Disrupted totally from a ground-up movement. Right. There isn't like an organized enemy that you can see and face. It's like everywhere, right. And it's just a different thing.
If you look at the disruptor on your chart, that is Aquarius. It's just the planets and the signs there that mixed. We don't go into that, but it's all the same archetype.
And you know, if you've been to any of the other Be Human Project salons, you have seen something like this theme recurring. Dave Gray talked about the movement from the top-down hierarchy to the network, and described the network as being something that looks more like biology than it looks like a machine, than it looks like a simple mechanical system. There is a aphorism that was spread about quite a bit right around the turn of the century, that if the 20th century belonged to physics, the 21st century belongs to biology. And I think the sort of facile interpretation of that is that, well, you know, the great innovations in the 20th century happen in physics, and the great innovations in the 21st century will happen in biology. But I think there's a deeper interpretation, which is that the models that are predicated on the way that physics thinks about the world, if you sort of elevate physics to an almost metaphysical level and say, what does physics sort of encourage us to think about the universe at a metaphysical level, it's very different than what I think biology would encourage us to think about the universe on a metaphysical level, and that there are things like emergence and interdependence that are fundamentally important in nature and that we don't see nearly often enough in the systems that we create, especially the systems that are used to help us to collaborate with one another. And so, I mean, I think the Be Human Project, generally speaking, is very sympathetic to the position that you're taking on what's changing right now.
Yeah, well, so this kind of raises the question of values as well, and the values. And so, how do you see? I mean, not that it has to be hierarchical, but the values of leadership that we were raised with in the 20th century. Obviously, we're seeing that today in this country, where the values aren't there. because they, regardless of how you think politically, they simply aren't there. I mean, you can be a diehard conservative and still think that those values aren't there. So how do you deal with that? How do you address that?
I observe, I don't have solutions for everything I observe, but one of the things I notice is when somebody does come up with new ideas. So there's Frederick Laloux, there's Otto Scharmer, there are people who are talking about leadership in new ways that is quite fascinating, and I'm very much paying attention to that. One of the questions we've asked each other for 20 years is how do you manage a hierarchical, this is hierarchical, this is, how do you manage a hierarchical company? It works if there's 10 of us, we can sit in a room and we can discuss what to do. 100 it's harder, 10,000 it's impossible. So how do you actually do that? But there are companies that are doing some very innovative things with management and leadership styles in such in large organizations. One of the first who did it was actually Volvo in the 60s, when they figured out that somebody was happier if they built a whole car bumper to bumper than if they put an engine in the car all day long. So they started to build teams, and teams built the whole car. Pride, quality, all the things we know about Volvo started right there. That's a different way of thinking about leadership, because those groups led the project and were responsible for quality from A to Z, not just for the quality of putting in the motor.
And in terms of the values piece, particularly if we look around the political systems that we're aware of in the world, certainly in the UK and the US, which I know best, the idea would be that whatever used to work has stopped working. That would be the first thing. And what often happens when what I call an old story stops working is that people kind of walk to the edge of a new story and then go, bloody hell, and run back to an old story because it's more comfortable, even if they know it's broke. So it's like everyone's pretending that it's going to be okay. And on either side of the political spectrum, it's not. There's something in the system that is seeking rebirth and regeneration, and that is stuck in an old confrontational paradigm. So based on the biology piece, I've been working recently with a wonderful evolution biologist called Elizabeth Sartoris. And she sums up kind of evolutionary history very simply. She says, eventually, every organism on the planet figures out that it is cheaper to feed your enemies than to kill them. That is why we are here today. As the pinnacle of human evolution as we know it, is because billions of years ago, single-celled creatures decided that they would potentially benefit more from feeding each other than killing each other. And they formed multi-celled creatures, and that's where it started. It started with cooperation. And the idea is that, perhaps we're still in our teenage years where we're still fighting for space, but in a network, you move towards, if it's not quite competitive, and it may not be quite truly, sharing, caring, but it will be some mixture of these two that will be a new thing. And personally, I couldn't enjoy more if politicians actually figured out how to talk together and come up with ways that suits everyone, instead of the polarity is so divisive and so unhelpful, and it's busted. It ain't working. I think we've seen that in the UK and in the US, certainly in last election cycles. It's not working. People want something else, but it's not there yet. But if there is an advantage, sometimes the other thing is that evolution only happens under stress. So that, we don't evolve in our comfort zones, let's be honest. If we've got the TV on, nice game on TV, nice beer, someone says, do you want to change? No, it's very simple. But if the house is on fire, someone says, you want to learn how to bucket water, you might be interested, right? And so I'm hoping that it is a bit of evolutionary stress that we're experiencing in order to push us into the Aquarian stuff a bit more. Yeah.
What, can you give me a couple companies that you think are on the hetero level versus the, I'm sorry. Could you give me a couple of examples?
Level?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. To research and see what they're doing and how they're doing it?
Buy Frederick Laloux's book.
Frederick
Laloux, yeah.
Reinventing Organizations.
Reinventing Organizations.
Okay.
He's got some great examples in that. There you get the whole thing. Yeah.
This manages to come up in almost every salon, but you might look into holacracy, which is a model for hierarchy and decision making in an organization that was adopted just a few years ago by Zappos. so Tony Say's group. And so it's just something to look into. There are lots of examples of this kind of thinking in organization design. But yeah, the Zappos holacracy thing is a very interesting place to look. I might also add really quickly to the question about values. I was lucky to learn from this guy named Jim Dater, who is the director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, very well known in that space, that he believes there are essentially 4 categories of visions of the future. And that the predisposition of humans is to assume that the future will be a linear continuation of the present. So whatever things are doing right now, they'll keep doing. And these 4 categories of vision he called continuation, so things will keep getting better. Collapse, things are falling apart, so they're going to collapse completely. Discipline, which is we know they can't keep getting better forever, we don't want them to fall apart, so can we just keep them like they are now? And transformation, which is a vision of the future in which the basis for understanding the problem changes so radically that the problem is obviated, it goes away, right? And I believe personally, and I haven't gotten Jim's permission for doing this with his ideas, but I believe that in the context of a cycle or a paradigm, that at the beginning, that the center of gravity in a culture is around continuation visions, that we want to believe that everything's going to keep getting better. But that over time, we start to see what we don't like about the paradigm, and we start to become increasingly convinced that things are going to fall apart. And that for a short period of time, we try to keep things disciplined, we try to keep it the way it is, but that's what yields to some sort of transformation. All the signs seem to point to the notion that we're at a moment of transformation now. Trust levels are at an all-time low since we've been keeping track of this. Gallup does research every year into our levels of trust in all these cultural institutions. We don't trust anything. We don't trust governance. We don't trust religion. We don't trust the military. Well, the military is actually the thing we trust the most right now, maybe because we're all so frightened. But I think there is something to this idea that in some ways the values question is tied up in the idea that most of what we have believed for so long, as Richard was just saying, is like no longer working. It's worked forever and it's no longer working. And so our trust levels are going down. And I think that includes the idea that there are firm values that underlie our decisions and our choices. And that on the other side of the moment of inflection, this inflection point, that values reassert themselves in a new context, in a new paradigm.
Thank you. So we want to wrap up and set you free for a drink and a bite to eat, and networking. So, I would just kind of bring it to a close by saying that we believe we're in a time of transition globally. We're in a time of transition archetypally, and that leadership teams and businesses who actively seek to align themselves to be in alignment with what is really happening are the ones who are most likely to be robust and survive and thrive in the future. And of course, those who step into this crazy position we call leadership in these times have a special role to play. However we choose to operate as leaders, it is a tough time to be a leader, and leaders need help and support and encouragement to keep doing it. Here's a final poem called You Guys. This is your time for frosty mornings in towns you will never know, for resentful receptionists and chirpy secretaries, for flip charts and outcomes, for plans and reports, for too much coffee and too many words. This is your time. This is your time for dressing in the dark and cars to the airport, for planes and trains and railway stations, for loneliness, for grief, for embracing doubt, for holding hard secrets in the face of love. This is your time. This is your time for being what your people need you to be, for managing fear while showing calm, for being their mother, for being their father, for holding the line or the hope or the dream. This is your time. This is your time for standing to be counted, for being yourself, for becoming the sum and total of your life, for finding courage, for finding your voice, for leading because you are needed now. This is your time. Thank Thanks.
As Richard said, food and drink in the next room. Thank you all very much for coming.